You'll find a link there to the Julia catalog page on this rifle where you can see their detailed photos, read their description, and place a Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian. I'm here today at the James Julia Auction House up in Maine, taking a look at some of the cool guns they're going to be selling in their upcoming October of 2016 firearms auction. And we have one here today for machine gun enthusiasts. This is an AK-47. And it really is. It's not an AKM, it's not a semi-auto. This is actually, specifically, it's a Type 58 North Korean Kalashnikov rifle. This is a pretty scarce version of the AK. The North Koreans didn't make all that many of them, and of course, not a whole lot of stuff from North Korea has ever gotten into the United States. Well, in the case of their AKs, their Type 58 AKs, which is, by the way, the designation because they were formally adopted by the North Korean military in 1958. Well, a lot of those guns were actually given as military aid to some other countries, most notably North Vietnam. And that's how most of the ones in the US got here, was through combat capture in places like Vietnam or Cambodia or Laos. I believe these have also shown up in Africa, so they do get around. However, they're one of the lowest production AKs out there. My understanding is only about 50,000 of these were manufactured, which is a lot for most types of gun, but it's actually a fairly small number for an AK variant. Now, we would describe this as a Type 3 AK-47. The AK, of course, was originally adopted by the Russians in 1947, and the Type 1 version of the gun was only manufactured for a couple years, from 47 until 49. And this very first version of the gun had a stamped receiver with milled front and rear trunnions that were embedded into it. This is how the gun would eventually be made, but at this early stage, the Russian manufacturing capability had a lot of trouble making these guns well. Russians had done a lot of stamped guns, but they were fairly simple stamped guns. Things like the PPSH front end was all stamped, and the PPS-43 submachine gun was an all stamped gun. The Germans, on the other hand, had a lot of expertise with very complex stampings, as you can see primarily in the STG-44 assault rifles. And it's very likely that some captured German engineers and scientists had a definite hand in helping to improve Russian stamping technology to allow them to manufacture the ultimate AKM rifles. Well, stepping back here to where we were, the original AK-47 Type 1 stamped receiver couldn't really make it work, just not reliably and repeatably. You'd have a lot of quality control problems and fitment problems. So what they did was in 49, they scrapped that stamped idea, or they put it on the shelf. They said, fine, we can't make the stamping work, forget it. We'll make it out of a giant block of steel, because we know how to make that work. And that was, the next development was what's called the Type 2 AK. And that looks a lot like this, but not exactly. The receiver is one giant block of metal. These are heavier guns as a result. 2 to 3 pounds heavier than a stamped AK would be. But it was easy, well-known technology, and they were able to manufacture them. In 1953 or 54, they made some improvements, kind of tweaked the design, made it a little more efficient, and that became the Type 3 AK-47. And that's what the North Koreans built here, is a Type 3. These are recognizable from the outside by this lightning, fairly shallow, but lightning cut on the receiver. That's on both sides. The Type 3 is also identifiable by these tangs, top and bottom on the stock. The Type 2 actually had a metal sort of boot holding the stock. That's the easiest way to differentiate between the 2 and the 3. Now, ultimately, by 1958, the Russians were able to get their stamping technology up and running and online and good enough to make stamped AKs. And they called that the AKM, or the modernized AK. And that's when production really took off from the Russian perspective. Now, they were using the AK as military aid to other countries during this time. And for example, the Chinese built them, adopted them in 1956. The North Koreans were a little bit later, adopting this in 1958. The North Koreans would update their guns. Well, they would start manufacturing stamped AKMs in 1968 as the Type 68. So these North Korean milled Type 3 AKs are, like I said, really quite rare. We'll take a closer look at the markings on these, because there aren't a whole lot of differences between AKs from different countries, and the markings are, of course, the most interesting one. So we'll take a look at those and we'll pull it apart. So the main set of markings on these is on the left side of the receiver up at the front, which is where you'll find AK markings in general. This 5-pointed star in a circle is the standard North Korean national mark, you could say. You'll find that on all the North Korean AKs. And then this here is our serial number, 2L, or that may be a Korean character, 7952. And this is actually almost a completely matching gun. Everything except the bolt that is numbered has that same number. So we'll see it a few more times. Then, of course, the other typical markings that you'll get on AKs are the selector markings, which are all going to be a little bit different with different countries. Here, of course, we have Korean language markings. This is in the safe position where it blocks access to the receiver. When we flip it down to the middle position, that is fully automatic. And in the bottom position is semi-automatic. We have a few little inspection stamps there, including another 5-pointed star in a circle on the right side. And that's pretty much it for markings on the gun, other than a few serial numbers that we'll see inside. This is going to disassemble like any other standard AK. So I'm going to push the recoil spring in. We'll pull the top cover off. And by the way, on the top cover, right there, 7952, same serial number. We can then take the recoil spring out, cock the hammer. The bolt carrier comes out the back, and the bolt comes out. 7952 there again on the bolt carrier. And then the bolt itself is a slightly different number. It looks like we have 15473. But that does appear to be a North Korean bolt. And that's really pretty much it for disassembly. You can see the stock tangs back here. That's indicative of a Type 3 milled receiver rifle. There's one on top and one on the bottom. Have a wooden pistol grip. It's a solid piece of wood. Probably not the greatest kind of wood. If you look at the inside of it here, it looks kind of porous, feels a little bit light. And of course, it has already been chipped once at some point by someone. All these features, which on the later stamped guns would be riveted in place, those are integral to the receiver because, of course, this is milled out of a big old block. This does actually make the milled receiver guns a little bit stronger. The stamped receiver AKs, ultimately, after tens, if not hundreds of thousands of rounds, will tend to crack just behind the front trunnion. Of course, that's not going to happen on a milled gun. Got a gas block out here. We've got these ports are there to vent the excess gas. The gas piston is going to go up to about here, and then when it cycles back, by the time it's gotten this far, it's got all of the momentum it needs to cycle the rifle. So at this point, whatever gas pressure is left is vented out these two sets of holes on the top. By the way, this is also a way to distinguish between the Type 2s and the Type 3s. The Type 3 here, these holes are kind of pointing upwards. The Type 2, they're horizontal right on the side. Got our cleaning rod there, which is actually not quite as far in as it should be. And then just a standard muzzle nut on the end of the barrel. These are chrome-lined barrels, which is kind of nice. Rear sight markings there are in typical numerals that we're familiar with, as is the serial number. So like the Japanese, the Koreans would use Korean script for some markings, and they would use Western type numbers for others, usually. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. These North Korean guns of any type are pretty Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian. I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction House. I'm taking a look at some of the pistols that they are going to be selling in their upcoming December of 2016 premiere auction. The one that we have here today is really cool if underappreciated by most people. This is what is colloquially known as a Grandpa Nambu, although the technical Japanese definition or designation for this pistol is a Type A, and probably the best, most descriptive name for it would be a Type 1902 Nambu. As the name implies, this was first adopted into Army service in Japan in 1902, although its development actually dates back to 1897. That is when a young Kijiro Nambu, captain at the time in the Japanese Army, arrived for duty at the Tokyo Army Arsenal in Kuishikawa and he was promptly put in charge of this program to develop a semi-automatic handgun for the Japanese military. Up to this point, they had been using Japanese Type 26 revolvers, and prior to that, Smith & Wesson No. 3 revolvers in .44 Smith & Wesson, and it was time to modernize. So Nambu spent 5 years working on this project, and this pistol is what he came up with. Now, this definitely, historically, there's been some talk of, how does this compare to, say, the 1910 Glisenti that the Italians had? Well, it definitely predates the Glisenti. This is 1897 to 1902. This is really a pistol that should be considered in the same frame of reference as the broom-handle Mauser, the Luger, some of the very early Browning automatic pistols. It is really one of the very first successful automatic pistols out there. Not the first, but in that first group. It looks kind of like a Luger. It actually doesn't really have anything in common with the Luger. This actually has several several mechanical elements kind of in common with the broom-handle Mauser. It has a tilting locking block, similar sort of to the Mauser, and we'll take a look at that when we take this apart. It also has a cartridge that's somewhat similar to the Mauser. Nambu and his team designed the 8mm Nambu cartridge, which was first developed for this pistol. It's a little bottlenecked round. Obviously an 8mm projectile. The original load was a 102-grain bullet traveling at about 950 to 1,000 feet per second. That's kind of a weak cartridge by today's standards. It was also kind of a weak cartridge at that time for a service pistol, but in no way out of the realm of reasonability. You could compare this reasonably well to, say, a .380 automatic. And that's really not that bad. Okay, fine, that'll work. Now, the Grandpa Nambus, it's interesting, they're called that largely because the Papa Nambu came first. The Papa Nambu was introduced about 1906, and it's basically just an updated, modernized version of this gun. There's also, in Japanese handgun collecting terminology, there's also the Baby Nambu. The Baby Nambu is a miniaturized version of this, firing the 7mm Nambu cartridge, which is basically a scaled-down 8 Nambu. It's a little tiny pocket pistol. You think this thing has a weak cartridge, that 7mm Nambu is really kind of anemic. At any rate, the name came about basically to differentiate it from what had already, at that point, been called the Papa Nambu. That's how it got the name. And all of these were actually manufactured with shoulder stocks, which is kind of cool. A lot of early automatic pistols were made with stocks, and this is a really good example. What's kind of cool about this one is it actually has a retractable metal extension here. So the pistol's not all that long, and the pistol is not long enough for like the proper length of pull on the stock. So in order to get the length of pull correct, they needed an extension, but they made it retractable so that when you're just carrying the thing in the stock, because it does double as a holster, you've got the minimum necessary length, so it's not awkwardly banging against your leg and getting in the way. In total, only about 2,400, or actually just under 2,400 of these pistols were manufactured, and they were made from 1902 only until 1906. At that point, a number of revisions were added. We'll talk about those again in a moment. And what's interesting is this was never adopted by the Japanese military formally. Instead, in 1904, it was formally accepted as a gun that could be carried by officers if they provided one for themselves. Japanese officers, like those of many other countries, had to provide their own handguns, and this was recognized as an acceptable handgun. Later versions of the Nambu would be formally adopted, of course, but this isn't one of them. So the manufacture of this was limited. There was never a big Army contract for it. They were all commercially sold pistols, and what's interesting is a lot of them went to Thailand. Have a simple gun to take apart, especially compared to a lot of other pistols of this period. You've got the minimum necessary number of revisions for themselves. Japanese, of course, but this isn't one of them. In fact, here in the US collector community, this gun was virtually unknown until a batch of imported guns came from Thailand. Those are recognizable because they actually have a Thai chakra on either the front or the back strap. This one does, and I'll show you that up close. And there are a couple different notions of when these guns went to Thailand. What seems most likely to me is they were probably purchased commercially around that time period when they were being manufactured.
However, it's also a distinct possibility that they were acquired in the 1930s. At that point, Japan sold a bunch of military surplus, basically, to the Thai government, and it would make sense that at that point, these guns would have been very much obsolete, and so they would have been something likely to be sold to another country. If you could get the money for them, fantastic. Ship them off, let the Thais deal with them. There's no documentation available, so we don't know which of those two answers is the case. That's one of many mysteries with Japanese firearms. A lot of the records didn't survive World War II, so there are a lot of things that we just are left to speculate. Anyway, let's take a closer look at this, take it apart, because it's actually a really simple gun to take apart, especially compared to a lot of other pistols of this period. So here we have the complete pistol on its shoulder stock. This does give you a nice length of pull, and of course, stocked pistols are easier and more accurate to shoot than simply handheld pistols. It's a cool idea that kind of fell out of favor in the 1930s. Anyway, the stock latch is here on the bottom. In order to detach the gun from the stock, we're going to push that button in, and we can slide the stock off. Once we have done that, we have a button here on the top. You can push that button, and then that extension retracts into the stock. We can then push that button to open the stock up, and the pistol slides right in. Normally, you would have a spare magazine in this slot, and there's a little hole right there for a cleaning rod. Now, this one is really tight. It doesn't really want to close, and I'm not entirely sure why, but I'm not going to force it, so we'll leave that alone. Before I leave the stock entirely, this set of buckly things is there to connect to a leather rig that would allow you to carry this on the belt. So that's what that's all there for. Now, the only markings we have on these pistols are here on the rear right side of the top of the frame. This says Nambu type and a serial number. So 1595 is pretty much middle of the production range, getting a little towards the end, but that's that. You'll find all the parts inside are also numbered with the full serial number of the pistol. I mentioned the Thai chakra. That's right here on the back strap in this case. So the Thai government added that stamp as a mark of their ownership. The Papa Nambu has a couple of relatively modern controls on it. It does have a grip safety here on the front strap. That's a very simple mechanical grip safety in that what it does is simply have a bar right here, which physically just prevents the trigger from coming back. You can kind of see it there. So if you don't have that grip safety depressed, you just can't physically pull the trigger back, and that pretty effectively renders the gun safe. Now, it's not as good as if it actually locked the sear or the striker, but this is 1902 that we're talking about. The magazine release is located right here, just behind the trigger. Very modern position. That's exactly what you want it. Push the button in, magazine comes out. This, people often think is a safety. It is not. It does actually have a little guide arrow on it. This is actually the sear pin. This holds the sear in place, and that arrow is there so you know which way to orient the top of the pin. So that doesn't move forward or backward at all. We have a tangent rear sight here. Goes out to 500 meters in 50-meter increments. So you've got one there, and then half step for 150, and so on. Sight picture is not bad. Pretty typical of this era. There's your front sight, big triangular front sight, just like you'd have on some later pistols. Now, the Type 14 had sort of a triangular rear sight as well, which this does not. This just has a normal notch rear sight. Now, for disassembly, we're going to start by rotating this rear piece 90 degrees. You can see it has a little alignment line there. We want that over there, and as soon as I've rotated that, it's going to come out along with the striker spring. So I have the magazine out. We're now going to do the one slightly complicated step. It's not difficult, you just have to know how to do it. What we need to do is depress the slide. This is a short recoil pistol, so every time you fire, the slide moves in like this. We're going to push that in and then push the magazine release button, and the trigger guard is going to slide down the frame, allowing us to remove all the guts out the front. So the easiest way to do that is to put the muzzle on a table like this, something that's not going to mar it. Push down, push the mag button, and then, if I can do this on camera, there we go. Then the trigger guard slides down like that. Now I can just pull all of the innards, get back in there. There's one more step here on the frame of the gun. Now I could take the grip panels off, but we don't really need to. You can take the trigger guard out, but I don't really need to. What I will do is remove the recoil spring. And in order to do that, we actually are going to take this rear cap and we're going to unthread it off the gun. This is the recoil spring guide rod, so I kind of have to push that in order to clear the lanyard loop here at the back. And that comes off. And now this is under spring pressure, so hold that while you're doing this or else it'll go kerproing out the front of the gun. Now we can take that out. We have a recoil spring and guide rod. Those are housed in this second cylindrical tube on the left side of the frame. Now it's kind of cool to look at this and realize that this entire frame was a single forging in the manufacturing process. This came out as a single block of material, and then they went through and drilled and milled out all of the stuff on the inside in order to turn it into a pistol frame. I'll point out this slot. This is actually a recess that the locking block goes into when it's out of battery. That's often thought to be like an observation slot to make sure it's set up correctly. I guess it does do that. But the actual purpose of this is milling in through the bottom here is far simpler than trying to get a mill head or a tool head in to this area from somewhere else. So they just cut it here, save a lot of time and effort. The very first handful of guns, they actually made kind of a decorative plug to fill that hole and then realized, meh, doesn't really matter. Anyway, that is our disassembled frame. Now, to take a look at the barrel assembly, we have our locking block here. We have a bolt. We have a striker. So this is our barrel and barrel extension. We have a lug here that the locking block is going to rotate on. This is our ejector. See it from the top there as well. And that's pretty much it for that piece. What this does is we have our locking block here. Notice it's stamped with the serial number. And it is going to pivot up and down just slightly like this. Very similar, really, to what a broom handle mouser does. When it's up, it's actually locking the bolt into this barrel extension. So it's going to sit like this. You can see the top lug here is interfacing with this locking shoulder on the bolt. That locking shoulder is a separate piece, so you can manufacture the bolt easily and then get the locking shoulder just exactly right when you assemble the guns so that they headspace properly. Anyway, the locking block holds that there, and because it's got this lug going through it, when it's in the up position, it locks the bolt to the barrel extension there. And then as this goes back slightly, this tab is going to push this down. Once it's unlocked, then the bolt can travel backwards beyond the end of the barrel assembly. Now, the firing mechanism for the Nambu is really pretty cool. It's not the strongest. It's definitely, in fact, it's probably one of the weakest parts of the design, but it's different and really interesting. So we have a striker here, and it travels in the bolt. You can see when it's all the way forward, the firing pin tip protrudes through there, and then it can go all the way back to here. All right, I have put the trigger guard back in position. We have a tab on the trigger right here, and when you pull the trigger, that tab goes up. You can see that's going up into the receiver, and it is pushing up on a very long lever that goes all the way back here to this silver piece. So when I pull the trigger, that silver piece goes down. It's getting pushed up at the front, it's pivoting around this pin, and it's going down at the back. Now, when the gun is in battery, this little tab on the striker, see that tab right there, is actually held behind this plate, and it can't go forward. However, we do have a lot of spring pressure on it from our striker spring here, which is sitting right there. So when you pull the trigger, that plate drops. That allows the striker to go forward past it, drop, and hit the primer, and fire the cartridge. What makes this weak is that this little tab on the side of the striker is very prone to just shearing off the striker. And this is the case. This was a design feature that's it's slightly redesigned, but it's still in place on the Papa Nambu and the Type 14 Nambu. And that's why it is strongly recommended that you not dry fire these pistols. Especially the Type 14s, even live firing them, they break firing pins a lot. So much so that Type 14 holsters were actually issued with spare firing pins in them. So it's a really slick and interesting way to do a firing mechanism, but it really was one of the weak points of the gun. So magazine here is unique to the Grandpa Nambu. It's also going to be serial numbered down at the bottom. You can distinguish these because they actually have wooden base plates. The Papa Nambus that came later, 1906 and onward, would have aluminum base plates. And the magazine, the angle and the exact design have actually been changed on the Papa. So this holds 8 rounds of 8mm Nambu. It does not have a hold open, sort of. The follower will stop the bolt. So on your last shot, the bolt does lock open, but it then slams shut as soon as you pull the magazine out. That's also a characteristic that would go on to be present in Nambu pistols, well, all Nambu pistols, all the way through the end of World War II. And it's not a good feature. So in 1906, the Tokyo Army Arsenal would institute a number of upgrades to this pistol. It didn't change designation in Japan. It was still the Type A. A new designation wouldn't appear until the Type 14 Nambu, which was substantially different, although used a lot of the same fundamentals. But these changes were a number of things that really ought to be done. Some of them were just aesthetic, but some of the more significant ones included increasing the size of the trigger and the trigger guard. You can see that this trigger guard is really pretty tiny. If you were issued this thing and you were in northern China and it's snowing and you've got gloves on, this is going to be a problem. They slightly redesigned the grip safety, the lanyard loop, which on the Grandpas is milled in place and it's fixed. They replaced that with a swiveling lanyard loop there. They redesigned the back strap of the grip, actually made it a little bit larger. That necessitated a change in the magazine. They also got rid of the stock slots. There are a very small number of Papa Nambus with stock slots, but those are kind of a distinct special group of their own and not standard. Those are the major variations right there. So basically, the grip frame, the magazine, the trigger guard, and the lanyard loop are the substantial things that changed. A few other things like the styling of this striker spring guide rod changed and some other stuff, but nothing else particularly mechanically substantial. Thank you for watching, guys. I hope you have a little more understanding of the Grandpa Nambu, the very early Japanese automatic pistols now. They're really an underappreciated area of pistol design. The Japanese did a lot of largely indigenous development, and they came up with things that are, well, here in the US, they've typically been really looked down upon, largely because of World War II prejudice, but there's a lot of good stuff going on in a pistol like this, a lot of clever innovation and skilled design. So anyway, if you'd like to own this one yourself, the stocked Grandpa Nambu is really kind of the epitome of Japanese automatic pistol collecting. Well, this Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian. I am, of course, here at the Rock Island Auction House, and you would probably expect that I would be looking at some gun that they're going to be selling coming up. Well, I am, although the table here in front of me is devoid of guns because I am actually wearing this particular gun. This is a sneaky little gun designed and patented in 1990 by a guy named R.J. Braverman. He first partnered up with the American Derringer Company to manufacture these in like 1993, 94. Then he split off and formed his own company and made them himself from 95 to 97, at which point he went out of business because it's not necessarily the most practical gun ever. The company did make a little bit of a comeback and existed from 2002 to 2004, and then went out of business again. And what he was manufacturing is actually kind of interesting because it is not an NFA item. First off, unlike a lot of people expect, and unlike pretty much all of the other guns in its category. It is a pen gun. Now, the National Firearms Act includes a category called any other weapon, which includes some kind of like leftover stuff from the other categories. It includes things like smoothbore pistols, and among other things, it includes guns that are disguised to not look like guns, which generally includes guns disguised to look like pens, or canes, for example, or anything else. What Braverman did was he came up with a design where you cannot actually fire this until you open it up, like so. And now, in this configuration, ATF decided it is distinctive enough that it looks vaguely like a handgun, and so they categorized it as a handgun and not an NFA any other weapon, which definitely makes Braverman's pen pistol, which by the way he called the Stinger, different from all of the other pen guns out there on the market. Now, why don't we go ahead and take a closer look at this, because it's kind of tiny and I bet you can't see any details at all from back there. So, here is our Braverman Stinger pen gun. I've got a regular actual pen here as a size comparison. So pretty much the same size. The Stinger is bigger in diameter and it's significantly heavier because it's all made out of stainless steel. All right, these were actually made in 5 different calibers. This particular one is in 25 auto, but you could also get them in 22 rimfire, 22 long rifle, or 22 Magnum rimfire, as well as 32 ACP, and you could get a conversion unit for 380 ACP as well. Now the way they work is you actually pull them apart. This cocks the striker spring. Pull it apart and you bend it down, not quite 90 degrees. Little trigger pops out, and we have this collar safety. So in its standard position like this, which is how it sits when it's compressed, when it's folded up, because this surface meshes with that surface, that's the safe position. Once you open it up before you can fire it, you have to rotate it like so to the fire position, and then pressing up on the trigger.
Be so I could join back the VC.
Hey,
Talking to my friends.
Arctosum. Oh,
Bye, guys.
The
I'm
hell?
just gonna play with my friends.
Can I join? Oh, come on! Suck my ass.
Fuck your ass.
What? Aquatic, can I join? Can I join, Aquatic? Oh, he can't hear me.
Of course he can.
Who the
He's
is
your
it?
boss. Your boss.
He's probably like a Last of Us lover. Are you my brother?
Yes.
OMG, brother. Wow. Great. Wow, I'm in a private server.
And you're gonna get wrecked. He's a
Who's
rank
got
100, you know.
Who wants to join my server? It's completely empty. Yay. I'm gonna win. I'm gonna win. Of course I have. I have been in a private server. Dumbass. Sarcasm, dude. Sarcasm. You don't know her?
Yeah,
Duh.
sarcasm.
It was so obvious.
Yeah.
Dude, someone's gotta ban this dude. Is Henry in this chat?
No.
Oh.
Bananas.
Hey! I was supposed to be the Banana King. Here you go, Aquatic. Yeah, I don't have bananas. I only have a You know what that guy did? He went to me and his private cat and sent a bunch of the.
He does that.
Can I? How can I freaking mute this guy?
Just block him.
There. Jeez, mother ever. He said no, stupid. Finally, someone I can talk to. What? No, Aquatic's been a mute.
It's nuts.